What if the greatest threat to Martin Luther King Jr. wasn't a bullet, but a letter laced with venom, crafted by his own government? No, not an enemy across the ocean. Not a shadowy extremist in the night. The threat sat in a polished Washington office, behind a mahogany desk, typing with fingers cold as steel, the FBI. They watched him. Listened to him. Slept inside his walls through the wires and hidden tapes. Not to protect. To destroy. A figure crowned with moral authority, walking across the blistering landscape of American injustice, and in the marble hallways of J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, King wasn't a hero. He was a target. Ask yourself, what kind of machine plots the psychological annihilation of a preacher who dared to dream too loud? It started with surveillance. Quiet, precise, invisible. Hotel rooms wired. Phone lines tapped. Friends turned into informants. Eyes behind the curtains. Ears on the other end of every call. But Hoover wanted more. He wanted King crushed from the inside. Not just defeated in the streets, broken in his soul. So they sent it. A letter. Anonymous. No return address. Just a cassette tape of King's private life, spliced with filth, wrapped in a poison note that hissed one unmistakable message: you know what you need to do. The intent? Suicide. Humiliation. Silence. Read that again. The most powerful domestic agency in the United States crafted a blackmail letter designed to push Martin Luther King Jr. into the grave by his own hand. Who approved it? Who typed it? Who signed the memo that said, yes, do it? Send the package. Watch the man collapse. These weren't rogue agents in trench coats. This was an operation sanctioned at the top, fed by Hoover's obsession, sharpened by COINTELPRO's vicious mandate. This wasn't about communism. It wasn't about national security. It was about raw power, the government deciding who lived and who fell. King stood on the edge of history, preparing to lead a revolution of conscience. And behind his back, the very government sworn to uphold justice plotted to bury him, not just in flesh, but in reputation, in spirit, in memory. What do you call that? Treason? Sabotage? Assassination by letter? The file sat classified for decades, locked behind steel drawers and red stamps, its existence whispered in hushed circles, until now. You're holding a story they wanted burned. Words they wanted buried. Names they wanted forgotten. Once you step into these pages, there is no safe distance. You will come face to face with the raw, uncut war waged against a man who refused to kneel, by a government terrified he might stand too tall. Are you ready to see what they never wanted you to know? Because once you know, you cannot unknow. The door slammed shut. Not in Martin Luther King Jr.'s home. In the FBI's headquarters. Inside, a silence buzzed like an electric current. J. Edgar Hoover sat perfectly still, eyes sharp, jaw locked, fists clenched on a desk littered with memos and surveillance notes. His mind burned with a singular obsession: Martin Luther King Jr. must be stopped. The man preaching nonviolence was, in Hoover's eyes, a roaring fire, too dangerous, too unpredictable. A threat not just to the government, but to the moral order Hoover clung to with iron fingers. Communist. Agitator. Subversive. Adulterer. Dangerous. These were the words Hoover carved into the FBI's files. Not questions, not suspicions, conclusions. Etched like commandments on stone. Outside Hoover's office, agents moved fast, eyes avoiding each other, carrying out orders they knew were laced with something dark. This wasn't law enforcement. This was personal. Every word King spoke electrified crowds. Every march, every speech, every headline chipped at the fortress Hoover built around himself and the country he thought he ruled from behind black curtains. But why did a preacher's voice crack Hoover's nerves? Because behind the polished facade of the FBI director stood a man terrified of collapse, terrified that King's dream would tear down walls Hoover believed must never fall. The fear wasn't just about King's calls for racial justice. It ran colder. Hoover believed King was a puppet, and the puppeteer was Moscow. The Cold War was Hoover's oxygen. Every threat, every protest, every cry for change twisted into one shape in his mind: communist infiltration. Red fingerprints on black voices. Soviet shadows in every civil rights march. And so, the FBI moved in. Bugging hotel rooms. Wiretapping phones. Planting informants. But this wasn't random surveillance. This was targeted, surgical, venomous. It started under the name COINTELPRO, a program designed to neutralize what the FBI called domestic threats. Hoover didn't mean criminals. He meant movements. Orders flew down the chain of command: record everything. Find weaknesses. Catch him slipping. Feed his allies lies. turn his friends into spies. Agents sat for hours, headphones pressed tight, sweat on their brows as they listened to King's private moments, his laughter, his doubts, his confessions, his flaws. Every slip was documented. Every human crack was magnified into a weapon. But Hoover wasn't satisfied. He wanted King's image destroyed. Not through courts, not through law, through whispers, through smears, through carefully calculated psychological pressure. He wanted King to doubt himself, to suffocate under the weight of betrayal, scandal, and self-loathing. Inside Hoover's files were memos that didn't just request surveillance, they demanded personal attacks. Disrupt, discredit, neutralize, these weren't suggestions. These were blueprints for psychological warfare. Agents drafted anonymous letters, planted rumors, called journalists, plotted media leaks. Hoover's fingerprints were on everything, the invisible hand guiding an invisible war. And King? King stood in pulpits, his voice steady, his words slicing through injustice. He spoke of light, of hope, of a dream. But behind every microphone, behind every closed hotel room door, behind every phone line, the FBI was there, watching, waiting, plotting. The most chilling part? King didn't fully know the scope. He suspected. He felt the eyes. He heard the whispers. But he didn't know how deeply the FBI had burrowed into his life, how carefully they were mapping his every weakness, preparing to crush him not on the streets, but inside his own mind. The tension coiled tighter. Hoover's office became a hive of plotting. The memos piled higher. The tapes rolled longer. The orders sharpened. And always, at the center, was that name underlined in black, Martin Luther King, Jr. What did Hoover see when he looked at King? Not just a man. Not just a leader. He saw a symbol, one he was determined to shatter, even if it meant breaking every rule, crossing every line, and dragging the full weight of the U.S. government into the shadows. King's speeches echoed across the nation, but in Hoover's mind, they echoed like war drums. Every "I have a dream" beat like a threat. Every Nobel Prize announcement burned like an accusation. The machine roared on. Inside the FBI, agents sharpened their tools. Inside King's world, shadows lengthened. And somewhere, in the space between, the collision loomed, silent, steady, unstoppable. The stage was set. The trap was tightening. And the war, though unseen, was already underway. No one could look away. The envelope sat on the table. Silent. Ordinary. Its weight was nothing. Its presence, a bomb. Coretta Scott King stood near the window, the autumn light slanting across the room. Martin approached the table slowly, eyes locked on the package, as if some instinct inside him had already screamed, "Don't touch it." But it was too late. Inside, a tape. Crackling, hissing, a reel of filth. Secretly recorded moments, stolen whispers, turned into weapons. And folded next to it, the letter. Not handwritten. Not signed. Just cold, anonymous lines, sharp, brutal, dripping with venom. You are a fraud. You are finished. You know what you must do. No name at the bottom. No return address. But the fingerprints were unmistakable, the fingerprints of a government machine designed to crush. This wasn't blackmail. This wasn't extortion. This was psychological warfare. Weeks before, inside an FBI office, agents huddled around a typewriter. Not just any agents. Men handpicked, trusted, skilled in the art of subversion. Memos had flown down from the top, find the cracks, force them wider, push him over the edge. The letter was drafted with surgical precision. It accused. It mocked. It hissed threats laced between the lines. And most chilling of all, it never stated its demand outright. It implied, leaving the darkness to grow in the mind. You are done. You know what you need to do. It dangled one answer in the silence, end it. Yourself. Historians would later call it the suicide letter, though no such word was typed. But the intent dripped from every letter, every pause, every icy line. The tape was no accident either. FBI surveillance units had followed King for months, wiretapping hotel rooms, splicing together moments, stitching human flaws into a narrative of collapse. The goal wasn't just to shame him publicly. The goal was to poison him internally, to make him look in the mirror and see ruin, to make him believe the walls were closing in, that there was no escape, no dignity left, no life left to claim. And they sent it not just to King. They sent it to Coretta. A cold, calculated strike at the heart of his marriage, his home, his sanctuary. A move so ruthless it silenced even seasoned agents, some of whom later admitted their discomfort in hushed, anonymous interviews. But the machine rolled on. The FBI's internal records, now declassified, revealed the chain of command. Hoover knew. His deputies knew. The agents typing the letter knew. They called it counterintelligence. But every word pulsed with something darker. A personal vendetta disguised as national security. A government hand reaching into the private heart of a man it feared. And King, standing there, holding the letter, must have felt the walls press in. The weight of public expectation. The bite of private betrayal. The relentless drip of surveillance, of manipulation, of enemies hidden in the shadows. Coretta's eyes on him. His own pulse hammering. Was it anger? Was it despair? Was it the flicker of realization that even this, even his own government, would go this far? Outside, the world kept turning, crowds chanting, streets filling, history pushing forward. But inside that room, time stood still. A letter. A tape. A man facing the full, merciless weight of power aimed directly at his heart. And the letter waited. Silent. Watching. Waiting for him to break. But the story didn't end here. The FBI kept pushing. The news tightened. The next moves were already in motion, sliding through invisible channels, aimed at the next breach, the next opening, the next point of collapse. The machine was not finished. Not yet. The phone clicked. A tiny click. Barely a sound. Martin Luther King Jr. froze, hand gripping the receiver, breath caught in his chest. Was it the line? The hotel wiring? Or something else? Across the country, inside a hidden FBI operations room, a reel spun. Voices crackled through headsets. Agents leaned in, their faces bathed in dim light, scribbling notes, marking timestamps. King's voice. His plans. His doubts. His laughter. His anger. His fears. Nothing escaped the wire. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's trusted circle, his beating heart of resistance, it was compromised. There were microphones in hotel lamp bases. Bugs sewn into telephone wires. Informants, friends, planted inside his meetings, shaking his hand, breaking bread, sitting beside him in prayer, only to report every word back to the Bureau. The SCLC office, buzzing with urgent calls, strategy talks, scraps of speeches, had become a glass room. Every conversation echoed into Hoover's waiting ears. Former agents would one day speak of this with a strange mixture of pride and shame. How they embedded themselves in the movement. How they slipped past moral lines. How they justified it, telling themselves it was for national security, all the while knowing, deep down, it was about breaking the man, not saving the country. Inside King's world, the betrayal was a slow poison. He knew, he suspected, that they were listening. But how far did the rot spread? Who could he trust? The smiling ally? The old friend? The staffer handing him papers? There were nights King sat alone, staring at the wall, heart pounding, mind racing. Who had heard the call with the senator? Who knew the details of the next march? Who had fed the press that private joke, twisted now into scandal? The paranoia wasn't madness. It was real. FBI memos show the scale. Teams dedicated to tracking his movements. Surveillance cars idling outside hotels. Agents recording room numbers, guest lists, even meals. They logged the names of those who visited. They tracked the phone calls, the letters, the smallest scraps of gossip. This wasn't a police operation. This was a siege. A full-scale moral and constitutional collapse, sanctioned at the highest levels. The United States government, the guardian of rights, the defender of liberty, had turned its immense power inward against a man whose only weapons were words. There's a moment, described in chilling FBI files, when an informant inside the SCLC reported back not on criminal activity, but on King's moods. His moods. Not crimes. Not threats. Just the texture of his spirit. Was he tired? Was he worried? Was he slipping? They wanted to know not just what he was doing, but who he was, inside. That's the part that rips through the heart. The surveillance wasn't just about stopping a protest. It was about invading a dream, crawling into the private, trembling, sacred space where a man's hopes live. Even hotel rooms, those fragile sanctuaries on the road, were no escape. King once leaned back on a bed, staring at the ceiling, unaware that behind the wall, in a hidden compartment, a microphone waited, cold and patient, capturing the sighs, the laughter, the private words meant only for trusted ears. But trusted ears were hard to find. Sometimes, sitting in meetings, King would glance across the room and wonder, who's real? Who's reporting back? Who's been bought, threatened, turned? The weight of that silent war, it crushed the air, bent the light, made every moment heavier. Some former agents, speaking decades later, admitted it. The surveillance went too far. The Constitution blurred into a shadow. The Bureau, charged with defending the nation, became something darker, something unrecognizable, something hungry. King, though aware of the threat, couldn't see its full shape. He didn't know how many layers wrapped around him. How many phone lines were tapped? How many rooms were wired? How many whispers traveled back to Hoover's desk? But you can feel it, even now, reading the documents, hearing the old recordings, tracing the slow, deliberate tightening of the net. It was a man hunted. Not because he broke laws, but because he dreamed too loudly, too boldly, too dangerously. The moral violation was complete. The legal violations were staggering. But inside that moment, that suspended, trembling moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the weight on King's shoulders, the burning in his chest, the creeping suspicion that the very walls were watching him, that the very air betrayed him. And the machine, cold and tireless, kept recording. The machine never slept. And the dream, King's dream, pulsed on, fragile, battered, but unbroken. Not yet. The night Martin Luther King Jr. learned about the letter, the room was so silent, he could hear the blood pounding in his ears. The letter lay on the table like a coiled snake, a flat, folded page carrying venom in its veins. His hands hovered above it, trembling. Across from him, Coretta sat stiff, her eyes locked on the envelope, her face carved from stone. She hadn't wept. She hadn't looked away. She sat upright, shoulders squared, as if bracing for the strike. The FBI had sent the tapes. Recordings, they claimed, of Martin's private moments, carefully edited, weaponized, sliced to shreds meant to pierce his heart, shatter his marriage, break his mind. But the real poison was in the words, the anonymous letter, cold, mocking, calculated. Urging him to take his own life. Whispering, "You are finished." Martin's breath came short. His fingers curled into fists. The wall seemed to close in. But Coretta's eyes never wavered. She sat through the storm, the tidal wave of public smears, the whispered rumors fed by FBI leaks, the journalists suddenly emboldened to prod, to poke, to print filth. Coretta, standing tall when the ground shook, when the headlines screamed, when even allies began to hesitate. She saw the man beneath the headlines. She saw the truth buried beneath the lies. But the FBI escalated. Internal memos, sharp as knives, plotted the next moves. Agents crafted press leaks designed to puncture King's Nobel Peace Prize moment, planting seeds of doubt, filth, scandal. They whispered into the ears of politicians, local police, journalists. Whispers became weapons. King would walk into rooms and feel the air shift. Polite smiles, guarded eyes. Reporters scribbling, recording, waiting for a slip, a stumble, a fall. But the real war raged inside him. He knew the walls were closing in. He could feel the noose tightening, not just around his reputation, but around the movement, the cause, the dream. And yet, he stood. Even when local police, fueled by FBI coordination, tried to choke off his rallies, when permits vanished, when march routes were blocked, when organizers were quietly threatened, King pushed forward. The Poor People's Campaign was next. The Bureau knew it. Hoover's memos, now unsealed, revealed the cold fury, stop this man. Discredit him. Prevent his influence from spreading to the working poor, the voiceless masses beyond race, beyond color, beyond the usual battle lines. Because if King united the poor across America, that was a threat no bullet could silence. The FBI's memos brimmed with urgency. Plans hatched behind locked doors. Quiet coordination with police, governors, city officials. Blacklists, smear jobs, backchannel threats. King knew. He knew the movement was being stalked by an enemy that wore the face of his own government. But knowing didn't lessen the weight. He carried it in his chest, in his bones, in his dreams. Nights when sleep wouldn't come, when his mind raced through every betrayal, every fake friend, every planted informant. And Coretta. Always, Coretta. When the letters came. When the newspapers twisted the truth. When old allies turned cold. She stayed. Not blindly, not naively, she saw the scars, the strain, the cracks widening under the pressure, but she chose to stand beside him, to fight alongside him, even when the fire threatened to consume them both. King's response wasn't one of fury. It was something quieter, deadlier. Resolve. He tightened his grip on the campaign. He refused to flinch. He sharpened his speeches. He called for more, not less. More pressure. More marches. More truth. The FBI didn't expect that. They expected the letter to break him. They expected the rumors to drown him. They expected the Nobel attacks to silence him. But every strike only seemed to burn away the excess, leaving something raw, something pure, something unbreakable. Still, the Bureau escalated. Their memos plotted how to fracture the Poor People's Campaign before it could rise. How to feed disinformation into local communities. How to pit organizers against each other. How to keep the machinery of the state turning just fast enough to block permits, cancel venues, disrupt logistics, not so loud it would spark outrage, but just sharp enough to bleed the movement dry. King knew they were watching. But what he didn't know, what no one could know then, was just how far they were willing to go. Every day, the net pulled tighter. Every morning, King rose into a world shaped by hands unseen, forces lurking just out of sight, shaping events, pulling strings. But even under that unbearable weight, he refused to bend. His speeches grew sharper. His demands, bolder. His vision, larger. He saw the Poor People's Campaign not just as a protest, but as a reckoning. And that terrified the men sitting in shadowed rooms, clutching their memos, plotting their next moves. The clock ticked. The tension mounted. Every moment trembled on the edge of something irreversible. And still, King stood. A locked room. A dim lamp flickers overhead, casting long shadows across a wooden table piled with folders stamped classified. It's 1975. The church committee has pried open the vault. Men and women sit in stunned silence as the documents spill out, page after page, the FBI's own words, their own hands signing off on the surveillance, the wiretaps, the blackmail attempts, the letter. The poisoned letter. The one that told Martin Luther King Jr. to end his life. The air in that room is heavy, suffocating, as the truth unfolds. Senators grip the edges of their desks. Their faces harden. Some glance at each other, some stare straight ahead, as if unwilling to meet the eyes that silently scream, "How did we let this happen?" The weight of the papers is crushing, but it's not the paper that matters, it's the cold betrayal they carry. They reveal a government that didn't just fail its greatest moral voice, it hunted him. It stalked him like prey. And only now, after Martin is gone, do the files speak. Historians lean in, their hands shaking as they turn the pages. Legal scholars trace the signatures on the memos. Former intelligence officers sit, stone-faced, watching as the record of their deeds is unearthed. Martin's voice had been silenced by a bullet in 1968. But the records, the evidence, the confessions, they burst open years later, roaring like a flood. The Freedom of Information Act forced open the locked drawers. The public could now see, this was no paranoid fantasy, no exaggeration. The government waged war on one of its own. The FBI's war on King was never just about a man. It was about his image, his authority, his power to inspire. And for a time, it worked. During his life, the rumors chipped away at him. The whispered scandals, the press leaks, the planted doubts, they painted King not as a giant, but as a man barely clinging to his reputation. Journalists hesitated. Politicians distanced themselves. Even some allies recoiled. But death changed everything. Once the bullet struck, once the world watched Martin's body fall, the smear campaign shattered like glass. In the years that followed, the files emerged, the truth bled out, and with every revelation, King's moral authority grew. Because here was a man who had stood against the most powerful government on earth, and they couldn't break him. Even when they tried to poison his mind, sabotage his marriage, crush his spirit, King carried the weight until the very end. Legal scholars stare at the memos and whisper of constitutional crimes. Civil rights historians trace the long shadow cast over the movement. Former FBI agents, now old and gray, look back and murmur of orders given, orders followed, regrets too heavy to name. And the public, watching all this unfold, feels the slow, burning shock. Their government, the one sworn to uphold the law, had shredded it in secret. The debate still rages. What does this history mean now? How do we understand surveillance, overreach, the dark hunger of power? Historians say, this was the moment America saw its own reflection and recoiled. This was the line where trust cracked. Legal scholars say, this is the shadow we still live under, where the state justifies its reach in the name of security, order, stability. Former intelligence officials say, with voices worn thin, we were afraid. We thought we were protecting the country. We were wrong. The moral cost was not abstract. Martin bled for it. Coretta carried it. His children grew up under its long, cold shadow. Yet despite everything, despite the Bureau's best efforts, Martin's voice did not die in shame. It rose, raw and defiant, from the grave. The records, once unsealed, only confirmed what his supporters had always known: he was hunted, but never conquered. His moral authority, once fragile and battered by whispers, became unbreakable. But oh, the price. The personal cost. The sleepless nights. The fear that every phone call was listened to, every hotel room bugged, every ally an informant. The weight of knowing that the people sworn to protect the nation wanted you destroyed. And still, he stood. Still, he spoke. Still, he dreamed. The papers rustle in the church committee room. The investigators sit back, drained, hollowed out by what they've uncovered. The truth sits heavy in the room, pressing down, filling every breath. This is no clean victory. This is a reckoning. The kind that leaves scars no report can erase.